there's a full house here because we'll all keep each other warm. I always have meetings in my house over the winter, and we try and work out how long it takes us to get the temperature to go up by 1 degree. It's actually quite remarkable how a lot of people in the room will make it warmer. So we'll keep each other warm, hopefully. So this was the sort of essay question that I was set. Can we afford a green future? I expect you know what the answer's going to be, but we'll work our way towards it anyway. But I wanted to start with a slide that's a little bit more reflective, because it's obvious to all of us we're living in turbulent times. Some of this is actually the result of the climate crisis, but there are other causes as well. And I think it's really important to recognise that people who can maintain courage and act with courage and with knowledge in times of crisis are incredibly valuable. And so, because you're in this room, I assume you are one of those people, but we also need to reinforce and support each other and support and look after ourselves, because, you know, turbulent times can be quite taxing. And so I think I like to try and be positive and act positively no matter what the situation, and I know some of us are struggling with that right now, so I wanted to acknowledge that at the beginning. But there definitely are quite a few good news stories, as well as the things that are a bit more challenging. So I think the important thing about turbulent times is to recognise turbulence as a process that can be creative. We do need change in the world, and change is happening, but what we have to do is grasp that change and turn it in a positive direction. It also helps to know that we're not alone and that there is a way guiding us through this. I mean, whether you have a spiritual insight or not, you know, I think to feel that you're a bit of flotsam just cast on the turbulent waters is quite unsettling. I don't believe that's the case. I believe we are making progress, and I'd like to sort of share my conviction of that with you. And we all have times when we feel more challenged, but we have to show courage, but also I think we have to have that faith that things are moving in a positive direction. And I'm going to talk about some of those during the course of this, also because our opponents tend to thrive on fear and unsettling us, so let's do our best to resist that. And this last one's sort of guidance for me from the Tao Te Ching, because I'm a totally impatient person and always rushing at things, so I just put it there. Do you have the patience to wait until your mud settles and the water is clear? You know, when you're not sure how to act, it's important to stay and wait until you have a sense of really what's the calling is for you to do, what action you should be taking. So I was talking to Jerry earlier for his radio show, and I said, when I think about the change we're going through and what the future's going to be like, I imagine it as being like Star Trek. This is the transporter. Wouldn't it be just brilliant if we could actually have that transporter? Especially once you give up flying, you know, travelling is such an unbelievable schlep. I'm actually going to the European Green Congress in Dublin at the beginning of December, and I'm sorry to say quite a few of the people going are flying there, and I don't fly, so I'm kind of like, yeah, actually that's like 10 hours for me to get there, and I'm really praying it's going to be quite good weather on the Irish Sea or I'm really in trouble. But I just dream of this time when you could actually get in. I sort of have that worry that your cells will be scrambled and just a little mush on the floor, but if it worked well, wouldn't it be a fabulous thing? So I went through this process of having my house renovated and insulated and taken off fossil fuels and put onto electricity. And that's really what I'm talking about here with this move of the world to Star Trek. That's how I imagined it, because it was quite unsettling actually not to have gas anymore. You know, that's what I'd always associated warmth with. Turn on the gas boiler, your house is now warm, and cooking in fact. But I had to move on to electricity, and the whole of our society is going to be electrified. We're only going to have electricity, essentially. But that's a marvellous thing, because this is where the vision of Star Trek comes in. There's no exhaust fumes, there's no particulates. You know, the dirt of the fossil fuel era is something we're going to leave behind as we move into an era of electrification and electricity based on renewable sources. I think this is the part, we've seen a lot of electrification of energy generation, and I've got a slide about that in a minute, but what we're not really seeing at the moment is the electrification of our transport system. That's an absolute priority. And again, Jerry and I were talking about whether electric vehicles is the answer there, and I think at the end I'm going to point to the fact that actually it's much more about changing our behaviour, so using public transport rather than just switching to an electric vehicle. But nonetheless, you know, the bus that we might be on, the train that we might be on, will be running on electricity. So this is major, significant and very rapid change we have to undergo, but I see it as a completely positive change, but at the same time it's quite difficult to imagine that new world we're moving into. But also I think we're not going to address the climate crisis unless we have greater equality within our country and also across the world. I'm going to talk about the global dimension of that in a minute, but there's two ways of looking at this. One is wealth is very concentrated in our society, and in order to make the investments we need to make to go through this transition, we will require people on higher incomes to pay more tax. Labour government's quite reluctant to do that, but I think that's an error, because otherwise they will allow private investment to pay for our energy future, and then we will be paying back that investment forever, essentially, through our bills. So, and on the other side of that is that people on higher incomes are producing far more greenhouse gas emissions than people on medium and lower incomes. So equality is part of the change that we need to make. It's a social change, not just a change in behaviour, not just a change in the way we use energy. Sorry, I keep bodging this by accident. But anyway, to me this is a better world, a world with a Star Trek future of greater equality, more tolerance and far lower emissions, but also a lot less pollution, I think is an entirely positive vision of the future. So what's actually happening with renewables is quite extraordinary, a quite extraordinary level of investment into renewables. This graph, I found this on Blue Sky recently, and it was titled Unshakable Pessimism. And it's called that because at each point you see the predictions of how much investment there's going to be in renewable energy. And the predictions are wildly lower than the actual investment, because the investment is just pouring into renewable energy. And we're seeing just transformations really in the way the world produces its electricity. This is happening far faster than anybody would have predicted or could have imagined, and this is a very positive sign. So I don't think we tend to get this news very much. We tend to hear a lot of talk about sacrifices and the difficulty, but actually this process is underway, and it's underway at really great speed. And because the fuels that are driving renewable energy are free, you pay for the infrastructure and so on that produces it and the grid to transport it, but the actual fuel is free. So it will mean lower bills, and it will definitely mean greater energy resilience and energy security. As I say here, we're talking about private investment here, but there is some government subsidy behind it. And I think, although I'm really impressed by the speed with which Ed Miliband is moving, and I'm basically an Ed Miliband fan. He's a clever guy, he knows what he should be doing, and he's doing it. If he's not doing the right thing, it's because Rachel Reeves is holding him back, in my view. And that's because she doesn't want to bring in enough tax to invest publicly in this change we need to see. To me, that would be more transformative. But this investment is happening, and and as you can see here, it's happening at speed. Obviously, with what I've said previously about how everything will be electrified, we need to have massively more electrical systems, massively more electrical capacity, and we need to have a significant expansion of the grid. The government is starting to do that, but again, I think they're not really being ambitious enough. If you look at their targets, they're all about decarbonising the electricity supply. They're not focusing so much on transport, and that's because they find that difficult, because it will require changes in behaviour, so less flying and people travelling by public transport more, and they don't want to make those arguments because they find them politically challenging. So that would be my criticism. But they have got the idea right about shifting towards renewables, and they are doing that. They are investing in that. And I think we've also got to think about renewable energy in terms of countries that have never had a reliable energy supply. And again, some of the better agreements that have come out of the COP processes is when countries of the richer world are prepared to invest in electricity supply of countries that have never had reliable electricity supply. So there's deals with Brazil and Indonesia and South Africa and so on. And that really means that a lot of the people, well, majority of the people who live on the planet today will just never go through that dirty fossil fuel era that we're trying to find our way out of. So they will move straight from unreliable electricity supply to renewable electricity. And that I also see as a very positive sign, and it's something where we can contribute. I'm going to talk in a little bit about our responsibility, our financial responsibility, but I think that's an ideal way to repay the debts that we owe for our past carbon dioxide emissions. So when I saw that graph the previous graph, I immediately thought, oh, I wonder where all that investment is. I wonder if it's China that's driving that massive takeoff in renewables. And actually, yes, it is. But this is another thing you don't hear, do you? You always hear that argument, well, there's no point in us doing anything because what about China? Well, actually, this is what China's doing. They're responsible for the overwhelming majority of of the renewable energy that was installed last year. Far more than the US. You've probably heard about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is a tax and incentive package to shift the country towards renewables. And look, it's been effective. They reached 388 gigawatt installed capacity. But China's way out in front, massively out in front. So, you know, please take this slide away and tell your friends, because it's such a powerful argument when the reason renewables are becoming so much cheaper is because China is installing at such massive scale and actually manufacturing the panels and the wind turbines and so on at such low cost that the rest of us can follow along and install these renewables. So Germany's actually done very impressively well in that year as well because of having to come off Russian gas. But nonetheless, it's overwhelmingly, when we look at that graph, we see the speed of takeoff of renewables. It's China that's really responsible for that. And here's a graphic that was used by the European Greens after the invasion of Ukraine. And it works better in French actually, because insulate and isolate is the same word in French, which I find rather odd, but anyway, it is. But you know, that's really the political message. If you don't want to be dependent on Russian gas, and obviously it's not just Russian gas, it's a lot of unsavoury regimes that are responsible for the production of gas and oil, including Azerbaijan, where the current COP is taking place. You know, the way to insulate yourself against that threat from authoritarian regimes is to reduce your demand for energy. Okay, yes, install renewables, but mostly reduce your demand for energy so insulate your home. So it's a political thing. It's not just like watching the heat go out of your window. It's also having energy security and not being dependent on authoritarian regimes. So we need to start with demand reduction. It's really interesting what you said about how everybody as an individual is trying to work out how to insulate your home. When I did that with my house, I felt I was being a real pioneer. How can you have felt pioneering to just have a properly insulated home? And my windows were terrible. My curtains used to billow in like I was on a ship. You know, they were so big. It was unbelievable. Anyway, I did spend a lot of money that I saved from my MEP salary in order to do this. But yes, there was like so little advice. It was such poor advice. And as you say, I mean, I had a fantastic green builder because I live in Stroud and I knew who the guy was. But it's very hard to find a builder that actually knows what to do. And everybody should be we need to do it at scale and at speed. And so, to me, this is another gap in what the government is doing. They are not engaging in a massive home retrofit program, which they should basically be giving the money to local authorities to just get on with that and starting with the lowest income families in their community. People could refuse to have their house insulated, but who would do that? Not very many, I feel. So yeah, I mean, if we keep making it, I mean, I'm Green, as Helen pointed out, I'm the External Communications Coordinator for the Green Party, so we're constantly saying this. It sounds really boring actually, but it's really hard to sell. Oh, home insulation. But it's by far the most important thing. So if I had one political demand, that would be it. Obviously, investment in renewables is important as well. And we need to address these issues of storage and smart use. So just now, when we've got cold, still days, we're not producing as much renewable electricity as we need to use. To me, a big part of the answer there is tidal energy, because you know you can hold the tide back and just let it through the turbines when you choose. We're a maritime country. I think the Tidal Energy Company proposed 8 of those around the country. They were just on the cusp of the Tories agreeing to fund that, and they refused, and that opportunity's all disappeared now, which is an absolute tragedy because it's hard to see alternatives to that. Although, of course, the other important side of that is to do, as you said you're doing, you know, to use renewable energy at night when it's basically there's more energy than people need. They used to actually use that at the Honda plant. Breaking my heart about the Honda plant, but they used to use that at the Honda plant to make hydrogen at night, which they then used to fuel their hydrogen vehicles. So finding ways to use energy when there's no demand for it, because the renewable energy will still be there, is very important. So I'm sure a lot of you are already on a night tariff, but that's a useful way to do that. doing your washing at night and so on. So we're all learning to balance the grid and use the electricity when it's there, rather than us choosing when we might want to do something. So a little bit now about climate justice. This graph is a few years old now, but the patterns hasn't changed that much. Who's really responsible for the CO2 emissions? You can see there it's overwhelmingly the USA, and the EU is obviously quite a few countries all lumped together, but these are the countries that are largely responsible. China, to a lesser extent. We always have to remember that China obviously has a larger population, but also a lot of those emissions are produced making goods that probably like this computer that we actually consume, so should probably be assigned to our tally. But we can also see, you know, some of the countries that really produce incredibly little, especially that block there, that's Africa. India is still way below its accurate proportion. So we get a sense of who's responsible for the climate crisis by looking at the countries that have produced the most CO2. And then we look at the countries that are suffering most from that crisis, and it's the countries that have actually produced the least CO2. And this is why the arguments at the COPs are often about this injustice and how can we repair this damage that we've caused? How can we pay back the damage that we've caused through our emissions? So whether we're thinking about flooding in Pakistan or droughts in East Africa, we're seeing more and more of these climate catastrophes, and they are bearing hardest on the countries that are least responsible for the climate crisis. Very hard statistic here, the 20 countries that account for 90% of humanitarian needs were responsible for just 5% of global emissions in 2018. So, you know, you can see the total imbalance there. We're all going to suffer from the climate crisis, no question, and we're all suffering from it already. But the countries that are most responsible at the moment are not suffering the greatest impact. And this is, when we talk about climate justice, it's balancing that out that we're really talking about. So the question is, can we afford to tackle the climate crisis? So the first and most important way of answering that question is to say that the impacts of the climate crisis are so vast, unmeasurably vast, that it's obvious that we have to find a way of preventing this, because the costs are going to be so immense if we don't stop the climate crisis from happening. So this is a picture of Valencia. I find it particularly sort of ironic, or is it symbolic, that it was all those cars that probably caused the damage that were all piled up there in the streets. And obviously tragic loss of life as well. That's why, to me, that question, can we afford it, really doesn't make any sense. It's so much cheaper to deal with the climate crisis now and stop it from accelerating and causing so much damage than it is to invest in the transition that we need to stop it happening. So the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, wrote a whole report about this. It was called the Fiscal Risks Report. So that really means what are the risks to the long-term financial viability of this country. And they measured the risks from the climate crisis, and their conclusion was that the earlier we address this, the less it will threaten our financial situation. So saying as a country that you can't afford to pay to stop the climate crisis is just nonsensical, because ultimately your economy and your society are fundamentally a threat from the climate crisis, and you will simply be unable to pay. And those fiscal risks are much more serious than fiscal risks from borrowing today. That was their conclusion. We tried to argue that during the general election with varying degrees of success, I've got to say. I argued this back to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who were very rude about our manifesto, and we insisted on meeting them afterwards. Yeah, we had a certain amount of success, but you know, it's the Office for Budget Responsibility that's saying this, and those are the people who were set up precisely to monitor whether governments were investing in a prudent way. So our manifesto was actually more prudent, so we argued. And here's my mate Ed Miliband. I chose that picture even though it's got those sort of alumni signs on it, because I thought it was a great picture, him standing in a cornfield with a wind turbine in the sea. I've got a picture I really like of me on a wind turbine with a mobile phone, high-vis, and a hat on, which is a typical green politician's photo. Anyway, can we afford to answer it? Well, as I've said previously, can we afford it? Answer 2. I think it's a question that requires you to think a little bit about where money comes from and how things are financed. And I'm not going into that in any detail today, but it's certainly an important question whether we finance our future energy supply publicly or privately, because in the fossil fuel era, people became rich because they owned the land where the oil was or where the coal was. Immense fortunes were made just by chance because people happened to own that piece of land. This is a totally different scenario now, because the investment, because the energy is free and it should belong to all of us. And to me that means we should be thinking about a future energy system where we're no longer having to keep paying a small number of energy companies, or indeed entrepreneurs, for the benefit of, for what is a necessity, which is keeping warm in the winter and being able to cook your food. And that's why I would really favour public investment in the grid, public investment in renewables, so that we have control of our energy supply. And as I say, Labour could have opted to do that. They could have opted to increase taxes on higher income citizens and bring in tens of billions for this kind of investment, and indeed for investment in public services. So I think it's a political mistake. And of course we do have that power of sovereign money creation to actually create our own money to invest in what we need. We have control over the pound, and we have the International Monetary Fund, which also has the ability to create global credit, and that's something that they did during the COVID crisis, and they could do that to invest in climate transition as well. So, these are more radical ways of thinking about what money means and how you create it. But when the crisis is as serious as the climate crisis and the future of millions of people on Earth, it seems to me we ought to have a global cooperation over making sure that the money is available through the systems like the International Monetary Fund. And of course the other unfairness is, when you need this level of investment, if you have control of the dollar like the US does, you can throw billions and billions at it, as they did with the Inflation Reduction Act. And they only have the power to do that because in 1944 we agreed to make the dollar like gold, and that's given the dollar huge power since then. And I really think it's time we questioned that ability that they have to just create money at will, which we have to a lesser extent, but which a country like Argentina or Tanzania just doesn't have at all. And so they're constantly borrowing just to make minimal investments. So I think, we're not going to tackle the climate crisis in a way that's just and equitable unless we also look at the international financial system. So I think that is part of the answer, but I didn't go into it in detail here. And the most obvious answer to the question is, can we afford it? We can't afford not to. It just doesn't make sense to, can we afford to save life on Earth? When money is something that we control and we have created, obviously we have to find the mechanisms to invest in the change we need to see to enable this transition to happen. And I think that's particularly important when we think on a global basis, just going back to the point about climate justice, because this graph is showing you the global distribution of wealth. It's actually not that dissimilar from the graphic about who's responsible for CO2, and that's not a coincidence, because high wealth lifestyles are also high energy lifestyles. But one of the conclusions we reach from considering both the climate crisis and the nature crisis is that the economy as we have it today is simply expanding beyond the boundaries of the planet, the boundaries that we can comfortably live within as a species on this planet. And so that's why, as a green economist, growth is not my obsession. You need to focus more on distribution and less on growth. And once you do that, you really need to think about the sizes of the slices of the pie, as it were, that each country enjoys. Because most of the increase in economic value that we've seen over the past decades when we've been causing the climate crisis have gone to the richer countries of the world and the richer people within those countries. And that's why I say that closing the planetary frontier requires an urgent focus on economic justice, and on economic justice on a global basis. I wanted to show you this. Who's seen this elephant graph before? This is my second favourite graph. I always used to share this with my students. It's some work that was done by Branko Milanovic at the World Bank. And what he's done is quite an incredible piece of work, actually. So it's global wealth, and he's considered people on a global basis. So being the World Bank, they had access to some fairly good data on that. And it's showing you where they fall within each 10% of the population. So over that side by the elephant's tail are the poorest 10% of the population, and over this side are the richest 10% of the population. Look how much richer they are as well. Look how much their wealth is going up, the elephant's trunk. And he's showing you between 1988 and 2008 how much their income increased for each of those 10% of global population. So most of the people over on the left there are in the poorest countries in the world, right? And most of the people over on the right hand side are in the Western developed countries. I reckon we're sort of, I'm probably somewhere there. I think people in my sort of income bracket, you know, upper middle class people in this country probably are getting poorer on a relative basis at the moment. But you can see that people between about 20 and 60% have seen a big increase in their incomes. But what's really astonishing is that the very richest people in the world are seeing massive increases on what are already enormous incomes. And this is the bit I think we should be taxing. Because when you live at that sort of level of income, what you're spending your money on is things like private jets and, you know, a lot of foreign holidays and yachts and a really energy intensive lifestyle. So it will be a huge bonus in terms of global justice, but also in terms of reducing CO2 emissions if we brought that elephant's trunk right down. Also worth noting that the very poorest people in the world have not seen increases in their incomes, and those are in some of those African countries and countries that haven't benefited from this general growth that we've seen in the global economy. So that's why I think something like climate reparations is really important. You've probably heard talk of loss and damage at the various COP discussions, and that's a way that the idea of really repairing the damage that we've done through our CO2 emissions, that's the language that's used to describe that at COP. We need to find ways of using climate finance to repair the damage. That could be through an issuance of IMF standard currency, but it could also be through us paying more for foreign aid, and to actually cut foreign aid at a time when we know how much damage our CO2 emissions are doing to developing countries, I think is really reprehensible, and we should certainly be doing the reverse of that and increasing the aid we're offering. Some of the private climate finance initiatives are very problematic because what they tend to do is allow the people that we just saw on the previous slide with their very energy intensive lifestyles to sort of offset that production by buying some forest in Gabon or something. You know, essentially coming to own other people's land so that you can use that to plant trees to offset your own emissions. And you can see how that is actually creating even greater injustice. So we have to be very careful with the kind of climate finance initiatives that we're seeing. But obviously a better mechanism would be to enable technology to be transferred freely, so that these countries can indeed make a transition to a clean energy future using the best technology available. There are some kind of deals a bit like that now, but nothing like on the scale we need to see, but perhaps they're a pattern for better developments to come. This is the elders. I'm not sure all the guys here signed the open letter you may have seen last week, I think it was, but some of them certainly did. I know Mary Robinson did and Danny Keenan as well. So they basically sent an open letter saying the COP's just not working and it needs to be radically reformed, and I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. And I also think it's worth noting how little we're hearing about what's happening at the COP process this time around. It's difficult to, I mean, the political agenda's obviously moved away quite strongly from the climate crisis, but also it's because it's just not got the same credibility it had, and that's because it seems to have been completely co-opted now by petro-states and also by fossil fuel lobbyists. And so that's why we're suggesting, the sorts of changes they were suggesting are to not have any, how would you have any fossil fuel lobbyists in a negotiation that's about ending the climate crisis? I have no idea how that was allowed to happen, and it clearly needs to be ended. And obviously lobbyists for other high energy industries or carbon capture and storage, there's more of these lobbyists than there are people in the delegations from the various countries. It's supposed to be a UN negotiation between countries, so we have to just remove the lobbyists from the room. But also you've probably noticed the last few COPs have been in countries that depend on fossil fuels for their economy. This time we've got it in Azerbaijan, which is an appalling regime that doesn't respect human rights, and but is also entirely dependent economically on the export of fossil fuels. Last time it was in, I get confused by the Gulf states. Dubai, I want to say Dubai. Yeah, Dubai. I always get confused between all those Gulf states, but I think you've got the right one. Another petro-state effectively. And so these elders were suggesting that host countries must demonstrate their high level of ambition to uphold the goals of the Paris Agreement, otherwise you wouldn't hold the COP there. That seems to me also essential. And again, we need to see much more meaningful engagement of the smaller countries that are really at threat, because at the moment it's the large, rich countries that are causing the damage that have the power in these negotiations, rather than the poorer countries. I'll ask you why you're smiling later on.
I'm Azerbaijan.
Oh, right, okay. You can agree with me or disagree with me.
Okay.
And yeah, we need to make sure that the people who are threatened most by the climate crisis are the people who are given power within the negotiations, not just patronised. And lastly, and I think this is really important, is the need to change our own behaviour. And again, I don't see this, I hate it when this is always described as a sacrifice. The way I've changed my home has not been a sacrifice. I'm just living in a different way, I'm heating my home in a different way. I don't have a car, I have an electric bike. That is a better thing. It means I have to take some exercise. I'm not a great exercise person, but an electric bike is a fantastic thing. These are not bad changes. That's why I like this picture here of the kids all, obviously in the Netherlands, all cycling off to school together in a shared cycling bus. And yeah, I think, to me the car is a big part of the problem here. Everybody feeling they have to have their own individual vehicle, because moving from petrol cars to electric cars is not the answer. The answer is sharing transport, having better public transport, and cheaper and more accessible public transport as well. Again, not thinking of energy supplies, the electricity sources that might be dangerous in different ways, but reducing the need for energy. Trains, not planes. We can talk about that later. I'll tell you about more of my crazy train journeys. But also different models of ownership, so we share things rather than everybody having their own individual item. And also reconnecting local supply chains so that we can produce and buy and consume things locally and reconnect. And this is also really important. All of these things are important in rebuilding communities and building people's mental health, whether it's an electric bike or chatting with somebody on the bus. It's a better life, it's not a sacrifice. I'm sure about that. That's all. Very much look forward to hearing your thoughts and experiences. Thank you for listening.